Mike, all over to you.
All right, cool. Thanks a lot for that. And morning, everybody. Mike Pfeiffer here. And in this session, I'll be taking you through building event-driven solutions with Azure Functions. And it's going to be cool. I think this is an insanely cool option. And this may be more of an advanced kind of scenario. So if you're completely brand new to Azure, I'll try to ease you into it. But this is, running PowerShell basically is the example I'm going to take you guys through today. In Azure Functions to process events. And I'll explain kind of what that is if that's not familiar, and then we'll get into it. So again, my name's Mike. I am an Azure MVP for the last couple of years, and been in the tech industry about 20 years, worked at Microsoft for a little while, spent some time working at Amazon Web Services for a few years. And for the last several years, I've been running a company called cloudskills.io, where we do training and consulting with different companies. And so one of the things that I want to kick things off with here, I know we just did a poll, and Cloud Skills, my company, actually is one of the sponsors of this event. And so we're super excited to be kind of invited to do that. And I'm super pumped to be here to speak on this topic. But as a sponsor, we're going to give away some seats in the AZ 104 Azure Administrator workshop that we're doing actually Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. So myself and Tim Warner, who's also an Azure MVP that you may have seen out there in the community, we're basically spending 3 days, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday next week, going through all of the domain objectives for AZ 104. So the new version of the administrator certification exam. And so if you hit the URL on this page, on the slide, cloudskills.io/Omaha AUG, that'll redirect you over to a page where you can basically get into the giveaway. And I set that up because I didn't actually take any time. I've been super busy. I didn't have any questions to put in a poll for you. And so we've used this platform in the past to do book giveaways. So if you guys just want to put submit your info, I'll do a drawing and we'll take 5 winners at random and give you guys a seat in the workshop next week if you're up for that. And if you can't make it, no worries. We'll record it and there will be a portal where you can watch the videos. So, at the end of this session, I'll draw winners, and then I'll just email you guys a code where you can sign into our portal for free. And then also what I'm going to do here just real quick is in the chat, I'm going to paste hey, good morning, Steve. Just saw in the chat. Thanks for doing that. I just pasted the 2 URLs. So number 1, the giveaway, and then number 2, the slide deck in PDF format. So if you guys want these slides, I only have a few slides. So let's get into it here. All right, so in terms of event-based automation in Azure, the thing that to me that is really fascinating about this capability is I spent so many years writing scripts that would run on a schedule and polling some kind of external system constantly on a regular basis, and then I could go off and take some kind of action, right? And to me, the coolest thing about cloud, and one of the coolest things in Azure and any platform really these days, is we can subscribe to events. And then we can really just define whatever logic we want to process those events. And so instead of polling all of these systems and all these different services, we can wire up these event subscriptions and then be notified when something happens. And then we can process those events with any code that we can think up, right? And so there's lots of possibilities here because we essentially, we have access to things like PowerShell, and obviously in Azure Functions, we've got other flavors of different programming languages and whatnot. But when you're coming from an ops background, right, and maybe you've done a lot of work to learn PowerShell in the on-premises world, and now you're getting into Azure, I think this is one of the most interesting ways where you can take your existing skills and immediately do something that adds tons of value. Because if you're looking at the slide here, right, we've got all these cool capabilities in the platform. In terms of governance, we've got Azure policy and cost management. We've got deployment and migration tools, right? We've got Azure Migrate and site recovery and all that kind of stuff. We've got security services, and that just continues to get better, right? There's so much going on in the security space, backups and being able to replicate VMs from one region to another, things like that. Azure Monitor, which is insanely deep in what we can do with it. We've got things like Azure Automation as well for configuration management. And I'll address kind of that because usually one of the questions is, well, why not use Azure Automation in this scenario? So, but if you kind of look at the slide here, right? Azure Automation, or sorry, functions, event-based automation is kind of at the center of this. And really, to me, this is like the glue when you can't complete something based on all the existing services that are out there, right? There's tons of capabilities in something like Azure Policy, where you might want to, prevent somebody from doing something a certain way. You might want to make sure they're tagging resources in a certain way, and so that works, right? But you might get into a scenario where it doesn't do exactly what you want it to do, and maybe doing custom policy isn't the right solution, or maybe the security feature that you're looking for in terms of notifications isn't there. You know what I mean? So it's kind of like you can close the gap on a lot of those things that you would like to see that aren't there yet in a lot of cases with an event-based automation solution. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to show you a basic example of how to create a PowerShell function and explain kind of the environments, how you can just get started and understand the platform. And then I'll show you a practical example. And I've also got a ton of resources to point you guys to. So after this session today, you could go off and dig deeper into this. So obviously this has, kind of a DevOps feel to it, right? There's going to be some code and some automation here. And, I would consider this like jumping into maybe the deeper into the pool if you're newer to Azure. So like I said, if this seems kind of advanced, it's all good. So just kick back and feel free to drop some questions in the chat. I'll try to answer some if I have time at the end of this. We'll see what happens here. But let me explain a couple of common automation scenarios that would just give you some ideas. This obviously isn't everything that we can do, but these are just things to just start giving you some perspective, some imagination on what you might be able to do, right? So on the left, for deployment automation, we got tons of support for doing automated deployments in Azure. But you might want to wire up some event-based things, right? Because sure, you could deploy an entire environment with an ARM template, right? You could even bootstrap your machines after the ARM template lays down the infrastructure with custom script extensions and all that kind of stuff. Use any configuration management solution that you want. But what happens when you're like deprovisioning virtual machines, right? So on the deploy example on the left here, where it says, when a VM is deleted, remove it from a monitoring system, that might be an interesting use case because we could subscribe to termination or deletion events for a certain resource like a VM. And when that event occurs, there's essentially a set of event data, right? So if you were looking in the terminal and you ran a command, generally you're going to get some kind of response, right? It's like, here's what happened. It was successful. It wasn't. And we're working with PowerShell. A lot of times we get back an object, right? It's got lots of properties. So we could see various things about what just came back. And an event is kind of like that, right? When an event takes place, we can take the event data, which is essentially, here's what the resource was. Here's what time this event took place. Here's who was taking action on this resource. All those interesting pieces of information, that's the event data. So if we're subscribed to VM delete events, that event data just gets routed over to a function that we can put in Azure functions, right? It's really cool. Another example on the left here, in the realm of deployment automation, when a resource group is created, look up the cost center for a region and tag it with a number, right? So we see some tagging capabilities in Azure Policy. And again, if you needed to go deeper, this might be one case. And one of the things that I'll show you today, I have an open source, basically a GitHub project that you guys can get to. We actually use it inside our training program for Azure DevOps. We have an 8-week boot camp where we go into this stuff in pretty deep detail. But basically, I'll give you guys access or just show you where you can find this on GitHub. And it'll be very similar to that concept. So when somebody builds a resource group, going off, examining the infrastructure and then modifying it with an event-based function. Some other things would be like maybe adding, AD groups or permissions, configuring some different things. Over on the right-hand side, some other interesting ideas, right? And again, these aren't everything, but it's just trying to get your imagination going. Because again, if you've got access to, for example, when you have access to all of the Azure commandlets from a function, there's so much you could do, right? Plus, there's other custom modules you could bring in and things like that. But looking at the right-hand side for operations, you might be doing something based off of resource measurement or monitoring. Yeah, Azure alerts and action groups are insanely capable. So even without this, right, you could do some cool stuff responding to an alert. You can shoot off an email or a voice call. You can invoke an API. There's tons of stuff you can do just built in Azure Monitor. But again, maybe you need to do something very specific. You need to, log a ticket in your own custom trouble ticket database, something there's no integration, right? And so that would be one consideration, performance related things. Another really interesting capability here might just be down at the bottom right when a certificate is about to expire. Send an email or even maybe update the certificate. So again, just kind of like some starting points to think about here. So as we move forward, I'll give you guys some more ideas on this, but let's talk about running PowerShell in Azure Functions. And so right now, PowerShell Core is what's available to us. And when we're building up a function app, I'll take you into the portal here in a minute. We'll go through all this. Essentially, your function app is kind of like a big container for one or more functions. And so we can have access to PowerShell Core right now with the current version of the Azure runtime. And we do have support for profiles. So just like you might have done on your machine to configure a PowerShell profile to initialize your environment when you open the shell, we can have a profile.ps1 inside of our function project that initializes our function code in our environment. And you might do things like setting variables or even some stuff for identity. And I'll show you a practical example of where you might use a profile for some of that stuff. In addition, we can do things like custom module upload. So if you wrote your own PowerShell module, you can include it inside your function project. And when you deploy, basically your code will just be there as part of the project, and you can invoke those custom commandlets that you got inside your module. One of the things I'll show you as well is kind of just like logging and troubleshooting, because the reality is this does take quite a bit of testing, right? So like very rarely do I write any code here and it just works on the first shot. I think we can all kind of relate to that. And so I spend a lot of time getting the code right and troubleshooting and looking at the logs and the output as I'm building a solution, because usually it takes a little bit of work to kind of work through that. But we can do local debugging, so we can run the Azure Functions runtime locally. So I use Visual Studio Code to do my development for this stuff. And it's really easy to get started with that. And there's great extensions and a lot of awesome support there. So I'll show you, how to deploy an Azure function for Visual Studio Code. But keep in mind, you can work locally and run the local debugger and kind of work with it that way. On top of that, one of the other interesting things here is managed identity integration. And this is something that's popping up in so many different services. But when you need to delegate permissions from one service to another, using a managed identity is a really interesting way to do this. So thinking about it this way, if you're trying to respond to some event from a function, and that function needs to go off and manipulate some other Azure service, you're going to need to delegate permissions to your functions to do that. So we can create a managed identity for your function, or your function app, I should say, and all the code running under the context of that managed identity can be kind of constrained to that security principle. So really, you're just using role-based access control to grant limited privileges to your managed identity, and therefore your code runs under that security context. And then that's how you can either allow it or deny it to do certain things. And this is powerful because one of the examples I'll show you today is responding to resource group deployments or creation events. and basically going off and then manipulating that resource group based on the logic in our function code. And that obviously is going to require that we have the permissions to do that. And you see that I manage identity concept in many other services, Azure virtual machines and app service. And so that's something that you'll run into if you haven't already at some point. And then in terms of, just typically invoking these things, there's lots of ways, in terms of the bindings for invoking and then outputting data. The input binding that we're going to use today is going to be an event. I'll show you, though, that we can use different triggers to invoke functions. So initially, just to kick things off, I'll show you just invoking a PowerShell function over HTTP, just so we can understand kind of like the request response workflow. But mainly, this whole talk is around triggering functions based on an event. In either case, though, if I'm invoking a PowerShell function over HTTP or even on a schedule, maybe I'm just invoking it, every day at a certain time, or if it's an event, in either case, I'm going to have some kind of inbound parameter or incoming parameter, just like you would have on any PowerShell function. And if that's a foreign concept, don't worry, I'll show you an example. But basically, that's how we can read in event data. And when something on the platform, we've subscribed to an event, that event takes place, and we route that event data over. It just comes in as an input parameter to our PowerShell function, our PowerShell code and the function there. And we can even output stuff. So there's, lots of interesting, Azure Functions itself has tons of different bindings, right? So you can output to blob storage and all these different things. You can also just, respond to HTTP events. And you can see I put the push output binding commandlet here, which is commonly used, and you'll see this in here. So there's some things to kind of think about, and I'll show you all this stuff in practice. A couple other things to think about as well is basically how are you going to pay for Azure Functions? And whether you're doing this for practical purposes in the real world, or if you're answering questions on the exams about Azure Functions in general, knowing the pricing plans and knowing this stuff is actually super useful. So starting off, number one, when you talk about serverless, you hear people talking about serverless functions and stuff. Mainly, a lot of times they're talking about consumption-based pricing, which is, the core idea is paying for code only when it's executing. And that's been the big promise with serverless functions. Obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously, I would say that a lot of times when you bring up the word serverless, it sparks controversy because somebody always loves to point out, well, there's servers somewhere. However, we all know that this is an abstraction, right? So we don't want to overthink it. We're not thinking about VMs. And when we're doing the consumption-based billing, we're limited to, we're not limited. We're only paying for code when it's executing. So we're not, dealing with idle resources. There's no VMs sitting there 24/7. We're only, we're only paying when we're executing code. Now, with the consumption-based billing, there is a credit, right? So there's 1 million executions and 400,000 gigabyte per second grant for Microsoft every month. So, if you're doing consumption-based function app, this is just the billing tier that you pick when you're building the function app, you're going to get some free credits, and so it's 1 million executions. It also depends on the amount of memory you're consuming, right? And that's what the 400,000 gigabytes per second thing is about. So big takeaway there is when you're doing consumption-based billing, you're not paying for idle resources. You've got a ton of free credits. However, you've got the kind of the thing is with that is the cold start issue, right? Everybody wants to bring up the fact that there's going to be a little bit of a delay when you invoke a function when you're doing the consumption-based billing because the runtime hasn't loaded your code into memory yet if it hasn't been invoked in a while, right? And that matters when you're doing user-facing applications because the user is going to pick up on the delay. In doing these event-based solutions, to me, it depends on what we're trying to do. But a cold start in an event-based automation scenario, not really that big of a deal because no one's really going to see it, right? If it takes an extra 1 second to invoke my code, most cases, for me especially, like it's probably not gonna be a big deal. But if you've got a user that's interfacing with a web app and they're expecting an immediate response, then the cold start could be a bit of a challenge. And it could be a challenge as well in event-based automation. It depends on your specific use case, but be advised that, those are some considerations there. And moving from there, last November during, what was it, the Ignite conference that Microsoft does every year, they GA'd premium tier, right? So this one, you're paying more money. You've essentially got a dedicated compute environment. And, so kind of muddies the waters of the serverless conversation a little bit, but you're not really dealing with VMs. However, there is a dedicated compute environment for your function app. And so that eliminates the cold start issues, right? And, by default, I think it's like a 30-minute runtime, but technically there's no limit. On consumption, there's a default 5-minute runtime up to 10 minutes max. And so when you're building functions, that's another thing you really want to think about is you want to do this in a discrete way. Your functions should be very focused and they should get in and get out. And that's my belief. However, with a premium function app, you can just run functions for a really long time. And the other big benefit there is when you're doing premium, your compute environment can be dropped into a VNet for complete isolation, which, as time goes on and more people go into Azure, and I'm working with customers, one of the biggest pushbacks when using managed services is the VNet isolation conversation. There's so many corporate or enterprise customers that want to be able to isolate resources inside the network so they can wall it off with their own stuff. And so you can do that with a premium plan here in functions. And then finally, you can also use an app service plan. So if you've got an existing app service plan already, because you're running web apps on there for something else, you can use that compute environment that you're already paying for to invoke your functions. As long as, in every scenario, there may be some particulars there, but that's kind of a big idea. All right. So let's go ahead and move forward here. I heard a mic come on. I don't know if there's a question, but if there was, just jump in and interrupt me. So I'm going to come back to this because it's demo time. I'll talk about these additional resources in a little bit. So let's jump over to the portal. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to build a vanilla function app based on PowerShell core. And then I'll show you just real general from high level invoking a function. And then I'll show you an actual full-blown real solution. Okay, so let's go to function app on the left side. Create a new function app. Let's put this in a new resource group. We'll call it serverless. And then got to have a unique name, just like a web app and app service. So we're going to say CS04, what is today, 25/2020. So I'm just putting a random number in here. And for the runtime version, we click the drop down here. We're going to want to do PowerShell core. So you see .NET Core, Node.js, Python, Java. And so we're going to do PowerShell core. And you can see from the drop down right now, 6 is showing up on the list. And I'm expecting any day I'll pop into the portal and hit the drop down and see 7, because kind of like that's the way Azure is, right? You're just in the portal one day, something new pops up. It's kind of a nice surprise. So eventually we'll see 7 pop up in here. But let's go to the next step here. So hosting, this is, mainly the big consideration here is the plan, but you see up here, we do have to create a storage account. That's where, your function code is going to go, and you got your operating system here for the runtime. We're doing PowerShell core, so that's going to run on Windows. And then here is the billing stuff. So this was the stuff I was talking about before. So when you're on consumption billing, that's paying for code as it executes. You don't have to worry about scaling the resources. There's an existing fleet of infrastructure ready to run your functions. Yes, there may be a cold start in a consumption-based model. However, you don't have to think about, I need tons of servers or load balancers or all that stuff. Microsoft figures it out for you. And when you hit the drop down, there's premium and then app service plan. All right, so I'll go with consumption. We know what those are. Finally, on the last screen, application insights resource. This is good for being able to get full observability for the function app and all of the functions in there. All right, so if you need to do application performance monitoring, the application insights component is amazingly helpful. So let's go ahead and create the function app. This should just take just 1 second. While this is coming up, what I'm going to do is show you going over to GitHub. In the Cloud Skills organization, there is this repository here. I haven't documented it because we usually use this like in a live event or in a video or something like that. So I don't have a README with instructions, but as you follow along with me today, you'll see how I implement this project. So this one is a full-blown, basically a project, it's all written and ready to go, and I'll show you how it works. But basically this is a tagging scenario, right? So the idea with this one is somebody builds a resource group, they tagged it a certain way. And if they built the resource group that was tagged a certain way, we're going to fire off an event-driven function to go off and do some more work, okay? So this is where you'll be able to find the code, and I'll come back to this. So honestly, I was just buying time for this thing to get built, but this should be done in just a second. So on the left, go to function apps. It'll show up in here eventually. While that's going, let me talk about these additional resources. So I will, I already posted the link to the PDF in the chat, so you guys have access to this. So number one, the documentation, Azure Functions PowerShell Developer Guide, awesome resource, right? So a lot of the stuff I mentioned already, stuff way more beyond that is in that resource. We got a couple of posts on our blog. There's first one, Azure Functions, an introduction for DevOps engineers. So this, let me show you this one here. Click on this one. This was written by Matt Alford. He's actually got 2 posts on this concept. So we got he's working on a whole series. So if you go to our blog, this is the first one. It's like an introduction. It kind of kicks off and takes you through the basics. And then there's another one where you actually get into doing a little bit more. And this is, I would recommend checking this one out for sure, creating a PowerShell event-based function after this talk, because Matt shows you a different scenario that I'm going to show you today. He actually shows you like processing an event related to an Azure Blobs object, and then also outputting based on that, and spitting out basically after invoking the function, spitting out a file and dumping it in the Azure storage account. So really cool solution. And also I put a link to the one I'm going to show you here, the cost center tagging option. All right, so did that buy me enough time? It did. All right, deployment complete. Let's head over to this function app. There is a new functions portal experience, but I'm not going to use that one right now because the screenshots on our blog and all that kind of match this. So I won't jump into that today. But let's do this. Let's just do a very basic function. So you can see right here, I can click on new function. So, in the real world, usually what I'm doing is I'm using Visual Studio Code. And so anyways, I'm just going to use the portal for this basic version. And in a second, I'll show you Visual Studio Code as an example for another one. So we're going to pick a template here, a webhook template. I'm just going to show you how to invoke a PowerShell function, a serverless PowerShell function over HTTP. And this one, if you basically take a look in here, a couple of things going on. And I got to kind of go quick here because I'm starting to get close on time. But you'll notice here, run1.ps1, that's our PowerShell script. And that's just our single function, right? So this one was called HTTP trigger 1. And, really looking at the code here, let me continue to zoom in just a little bit so it's a little bit easier to read. If you look in here, we have a param block, just like you would have in any PowerShell function. And the request, in this case, the $request variable that we're seeing there, that is actually going to be the incoming HTTP request. So as a user, if I invoke this thing over the web and, kind of send a request to this function, all the information about my request is going to be in this parameter, okay? And so what they're showing here, this boilerplate kind of basic code, is they're looking in the request either in the query string or in the body, right? And then, so they're looking for a name, right? If it's in the query string or if it's in the body of the request, then they're going to spit back an HTTP 200 OK message with a hello, in this case, Mike. So the idea is I'm sending a name to the function. It's going to echo it back. It's a hello world type of function. And they kind of show you error handling in here and stuff, right? So if you wanted to, it's good practice when you're building an API to send a request or a status code for every response. So if everything was cool, send an OK status code. And if it didn't work out, send a bad request to the body along with that. And you can see down here at the very bottom, push output binding. And what we're doing here is we're actually pushing an HTTP response and sending information back to the user. So we can grab the URL here. You'll see that it's got a code included in it. So it's actually got a function key, essentially, or an API key. You can control that by, either turning it off or requiring some different things here. You can also put API management in front of Azure Functions, but we're talking about processing events today, so I'm not going to get into that. But let me show you kind of like the log streaming service. So we'll see output when we invoke this function right here in this screen. So let me just copy this URL and head over to the address bar, plug this in here, and then say, along with the URL and the code and all that, I'll say name equals Mike in the address bar. And that one didn't run, so let me do it in the terminal here. So we'll say curl, and then name equals Mike. And that didn't work. So let's do this. I'm doing something wrong here. Let me go over to the right-hand side. There's a little test utility right here. So notice here where they're like, hey, send a post. And it may be that the function isn't accepting a GET request. But notice here the request body gets wired up because they're looking in the body as well of the incoming requests. And so it's actually going to say, hey, the name is equal to, in this case, Mike, right? And so if we send a post, click on the run button here in the bottom right, and we see the response, hello, Mike, right? And we can see over here in the log streaming service that it's like, hey, we processed the function, okay? So in the interest of time, let me show you an actual event-based solution, okay? So I'm gonna grab this code here, and I'm gonna clone this repository locally. So let's see, where am I? I'm in an empty folder. So we'll say git clone. And you could do this in your own temporary account here. So I'll open up this repo here that we've got, just very basic. I'll open it up in Visual Studio Code. And I'll just kind of step through a couple things real quick. So in here, the requirements.psd1, I don't want to update right now. And we'll say not now. Yes, we'll initialize this project. Close this. And so in the requirements.psd1, notice we've got a hash table that says AZ equals 3.star. And you can read more about this here, but this is our dependency management. And what that's saying is include the AZ module for PowerShell. So the actual PowerShell module for Azure, the current version. And I'd love to talk more about this, but just hit the link in this description here because there's some cool capabilities based on pulling down modules based on version numbers and so forth. Moving on from there, though, take a look at profile.ps1 in this project. So this profile will execute when the function app starts up for the very first time. And basically, we've got some code in here that I'll explain in a minute, but you could put any initialization code that you want in here. If you look at the host.json, this is actually the configuration for the function app itself. So we're saying manage dependencies are enabled. And what that means is we're going to go ahead and import that AZ module. You can import other modules from PowerShell Gallery as well. And so that's kind of the high level. And then the actual function app, the function itself that I've got over here called process event. This is the one that right here in run1.ps1. I'm not going to go through every line of this because the idea is just to show you the capability. But the idea with this one is when somebody creates a resource group and it's tagged with an environment variable, then we're going to tag it with a cost center number. And I'll show you exactly how this is going to work, okay? And I'm actually going to deploy this function app in this code right here from Visual Studio. So number one, if you go over to extensions, I've got the Azure account extension, so I can sign into Azure from installed. This is a Microsoft extension. You can just go get that quick and easy. Then there's the Azure Functions extension, and I got all the function tools installed and all that kind of stuff. And if you look at the very bottom left, you can see I'm already signed into Azure. So all I got to do is go to the little Azure icon over on the left-hand side, and then I got this functions option here. So I can walk up to this little button right here and say, hey, let's create a new function, or even say, hey, let's deploy this one and then create a new function app altogether. So when I click the deployment button, I'm going to say new function app for this one. And we'll just say CS event CS, or 04/25/2020. So I'm going to create a function app for Visual Studio Code, put this one in WestUS 2. And kind of hard to see, but at the very bottom, it's creating my dependencies, my storage account. It's going to create the function app. It's then going to deploy all the code that I've got in here. And then I'll show you a quick example of creating a resource group and processing the event. And so while that's building, let me show you this. This is the idea for processing this event and what we're going to do with this example. So when you go in to build a resource group, right? Let's say you're building a VM or something, call it web servers, right? Create a web servers resource group, click on next. And we might tag this like environment, env, environment is development, for example, right? And so we could enforce tags with policy, but let's imagine when we're building a resource group, if somebody tags it, environment is development, then we want to add another tag for cost center that sets the cost center ID for development. If they enter production, we want to do the cost center tag for production. And so we've got some conditional logic in here in this function. Obviously, it could do multiple things when it's processing this event, right? So the idea is just understanding the workflow, not necessarily, this is going to be something everybody has to do, right? So we'll create that one. And nothing's going to happen, right? Because we don't have a function built for that yet, an event-driven function. But let's see, we still see that our function code is deploying. So let's just give that another second. We can check the output window to see what's going on here. So it looks like, created our resource group, our storage. Looks like it's deploying our code. This will be done in just a second. All right, deployment successful. So back over in the portal, let's jump over to function apps. So here's the one that we just built, completely different function app, right? And we come in here, I'm going to do a couple things. And then again, I got to move kind of quick because I'm running out of time, but notice my function app is read-only, right? Because I'm deploying for Visual Studio Code, that's normal. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to platform features. I'm going to go to identity. And I'm going to create a system assigned managed identity for this function app. And I'm going to delegate permissions to the function app on my Azure subscription. So it says, hey, I'm going to create an identity called CS events. Cool. So that's going to register that with Azure AD. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to assign some broad permissions here. Normally, I would do this kind of in the light way, or do this more explicitly. And this is actually new. I haven't seen them actually light this up before. Azure role assignments, that's awesome. So that was a new capability. But what I'm going to do here is just go directly to my subscription. So this will be kind of a broad assignment, right? Generally, I might do things a little bit more limited. But anyways, I'm going to go to the subscription and add a role assignment and say that this function app is going to be a contributor on this development subscription. And that was CS event was the identity, right? That's very interesting. Let's double check Azure AD, app registrations. Didn't look like it took it. Let's go back over here. I've noticed lately there's been a little bit of latency that when working with some like building resources and having them show up right away. Let me do that one more time. So going back over to role assignments, click on add role assignment. Let's see. There it is. So we're going to set contributor to that identity. So that is the function app's identity, right? So we'll save that. And so that's going to give the code in the function app the ability to do pretty much anything in my subscription other than give somebody else permissions. And so really this thing only needs an event subscription at this point. So if I come up here and look for, or another way I could do this actually might be a little bit of a cleaner way. You go to the function itself. So if we go to the process event function, we can see right here, there's add an event grid subscription. So I got 3 minutes. Let's see if we can do it. So we're going to say process event. Down here for the topic type, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, listen on all my subscriptions, or at least on this pay-as-you-go subscription that I'm dealing with right now. And for the event types, this is the important part, I'm going to listen for resource write success. All right. And so anytime things are getting written into my subscription, I want to trigger that as an event. And in my code, if you go through and take a look at the code in this example here, I'm not going to drag you through it right now. You'll see though that I'm actually searching through the event data for the subject and finding resource group related events. Okay, so that's what this is all about. So let me create this subscription. And then from there, every time I create a resource group that's tagged a certain way, that'll invoke my function because I'm going to have the event wired up and the function will basically be listening for those changes. And one thing I'll say about this is you might expect it to be immediate. I mean, it's pretty quick, but it's not synchronous, right? So if I go off now and do something, it's not like my function is going to execute initially or immediately, I should say. And so really what I'm getting at is if I come in here to create a new resource group and I call it, web servers 2, this event of creating this resource group should trigger as long as I tag it the right way. If I say, because it's listening for environment development, for example, if it sees this, it'll fire my function. It just might take a second longer than I'm expecting because, again, I'm using consumption-based billing. I've never invoked this function before, and this is not a synchronous operation. So the event is going to take place. It's going to route that event data to the function, and the function will invoke it eventually, but I might just not see what I'm expecting to see right away, right? But it should process it. And if I have issues where it's not, my code isn't working, I could always go back and go into the logging service, right? So if I go back in here, if I'm actually looking at my function and looking at the log stream, let's see, then, we'll see like what the function is doing, right? And so what I'm expecting to see based on this event-driven function is when I'm looking at my resource group, I got web servers 2, we go to tags. Right now, we just see env development, right, as a tag and nothing else. And so right now, my function, my event-driven function hasn't executed. And so let's go back over and take a look. Let's look at the logs. Notice that there's some stuff that was bombing out there, so I need to probably debug that a little bit, but check it out. It did run some stuff here, right? So I saw something that was complaining about there's something in my code I got to fix, but watch, if you go over here and take a look at web servers 2, it's now got 2 tags. One's got a cost center 001, then we got environment development, and it is 8 o'clock in Phoenix. That's the top of the hour, and so I finish it right on time. I'm glad that I'm not going to step on anybody else's presentation. So check the GitHub repo for the sample code here if you want to kind of follow along with that. And I hope that that's given you some ideas and some inspiration for maybe building your own solutions going forward. Remember, put the link for the giveaway out there in the chat. So feel free to join in on that, and we'll draw winners here in just a little bit. Thanks, everybody.